Hey everybody. So I want to show you guys a clip that is something that didn't quite make it into the minds of men, but is something that I think we should discuss for a little bit because, not everything could make it into that movie. That's a 4 hour long, well, almost 4 hour long movie. And there was just some things that we just couldn't put everything in there. But this is something that I saved aside and I thought, in the future, we're going to have to talk about this too, because it's another one of these things that people just need to see for themselves. A lot of what was going on in the 70s and even the Revelations too, I think in many ways, looking back on that in retrospect, is just a way of getting the public ready for the scientific dictatorship that was coming. The technocracy that was burgeoning at that time and that we now live under today. I think a lot of putting this stuff out in the public was just acclimating everyone that the world has changed and the world is going to continue to change, and there's going to be all this technology and things are going to be vastly different from anything that you can even imagine now, kind of stuff that they were trying to get people basically ready for. We have been compartmentalized in this country for decades and decades. Compartmentalization ruled the day during World War II. And by the time anything came out to the public, it was going through levels before it ever got to the public of editing, crafting, here's what we need people to hear about or know about or think about today kind of stuff. So the things that were getting promoted at that time, it wasn't just on a whim because someone thought of it. If something was widespread being pushed to the public through newspapers and television, it's because they wanted everybody to think about that and see that and be acclimated to that idea. They wanted to legitimize it.
Washington, David Brinkley has something to say about a technique called psychological disarmament.
In 1971, the president of the American Psychological Association came out and said, we need to psychologically disarm and control, essentially, our world leaders.
It is known that many, if not most, of the wars in history have been started by kings, dictators, prime ministers, and presidents, driven to war by their personal vanity, ego, and a thirst for glory at somebody else's expense. World War II is a perfect example. Other examples are quite recent. Well, through the ages into our own age, countries and peoples have lived with this problem and died with it. Well, Dr. Kenneth Clark is a psychologist, president of the American Psychological Association. In a speech to the association's convention, he offered his solution to this, and whatever else it certainly is novel. His solution is to put the leaders of the world's great powers on a diet of drugs, tranquilizers or something, to reduce their ego drives and aggressiveness, and to expand the humane and loving aspects of their personalities. He said international agreements on this could be signed as we now sign disarmament agreements, and it could be called psychological disarmament.
And it wasn't just something that he said in a speech. He actually went on to write a column about that went into the newspaper. This story was widely promoted all over the newspapers, all over the country.
It does make an engaging picture. The leader of some aggressive country at his desk, laughing and smiling to himself, fat and happy like Gene Herschel, dandling his grandchildren on his knee, patting his dog, not a hostile thought in his head, totally incapable of picking up the phone to start a war. Of course, there are some questions like how to make sure they're all taking their pills and keeping themselves drugged. Dr. Clark's idea may not be the solution to this problem, but it is a good description of it. John?
It was also promoted, obviously, on television. So this concept was not just injected into the mass consciousness through the media, it was being legitimized that way. It is really hard for people to wrap their minds around the concept that nothing that gets promoted in the media is just promoted in the media and that's it. These are things that even if it's something bad, they want you to, it's a legitimization of it. There's no such thing as bad press for anybody. It's all promotion of something. So that's what the media does. They promote ideas. They inject ideas and promote ideas. That's what they do. And so this is obviously something that was being widely promoted. If I talked about this today as an idea, like, hey guys, you know, you want to ward off war, here's what's going to happen, like we should do this, like everyone would say that I was a crazy person who was insanely coming up with these just rantings of a lunatic. But obviously they were promoting this on mainstream media outlets as if it's a real idea that we should actually really consider as a public. They were saying this is something. But what they don't say is who's going to make decisions like that. Who's going to make decisions like that is going to be a scientific dictatorship. That's who makes decisions like that. And a story like this, what it's actually saying to the public, what they're actually trying to communicate here is this is the level that technology is at. And interestingly, the way that this was promoted in the media had to do with drugs. And he's like, drugs or something.
His solution is to put the leaders of the world's great powers on a diet of drugs, tranquilizers or something.
The guy from the APA didn't actually say drugs. He didn't actually say we're going to put people on a cocktail of drugs. I actually found the op-ed, which not many places printed this op-ed, because I didn't find it in very many places, the actual op-ed. The article about giving the drugs to all the leaders that the media ran with, that was all over the place. But Kenneth Clark's actual statement of what he actually said, that was printed in very few places. But I did find one where he actually goes in depth on what he's suggesting here. And he does not necessarily say drugs, because he goes through the whole thing about the techniques of religion and moral philosophy and law and education and all these other things that used to be the civilized approach to controlling man's primitive and egocentric behavior. That's all the pre-nuclear age. Once we went nuclear with it, there's too much on the line, right? So that's the narrative that then goes into the fact that it's the psychotechnical era. So I'm just going to read this last part, because again, all of the media said this was drugs, but you have to hear what the man himself actually was saying. He says the work on the effects of direct stimulation of certain areas of the brain, the role of specific areas of the midbrain in controlling certain effects, the effects of certain drugs on exciting, tranquilizing, or depressing the emotional and motivational levels of the individual, and the effects of externally induced behavioral changes on internal biochemistry of the organism suggests that we might be on the threshold of that type of scientific biochemical intervention which could stabilize and make dominant the moral and ethical propensities of man. It is now possible, indeed imperative, to reduce human anxieties, tensions, hostilities, violence, cruelty, and this part's got a bit of a grammatical issue, the destructive power irrationalities of man, which are the basis of wars. It is an awesome fact that a few men in the leadership positions in the industrialized nations of the world now have the power to determine among themselves the survival or extinction of human civilization. Given these facts, it would seem logical that a requirement imposed upon all power-controlling leaders and those who aspire to such leadership would be that they accept and use the earliest perfected form of psychotechnological biochemical intervention, which would assure their positive use of power and reduce or block the possibility of their using power destructively. So that is not necessarily drugs. He does mention drugs, but he mentions drugs alongside a whole slew of psychotechnologies, and he wraps all that together and says we're going to use the earliest perfected form of psychotechnological biochemical intervention. Because the media just ran with the drug angle. They just ran with it. And that is actually not what the man himself was saying. Interestingly enough, about 1971 is it's the same year that it came out famously later. And it was actually head psychologist for CIA, Sidney Gottlieb, who I talked about a few videos ago, who said this in testimony, in congressional testimony at the Kennedy hearing in 1977. He was talking about how there was an incident with Nixon back in 71, and they were careful not to say which country this was that Nixon visited with his entourage, but it was narrowed down to either Russia or China. And as I've reported on this channel before, Russia had its own MK Ultra project. They actually spent $1 billion. This came out on record just back in, I think, 2013, something like that, that all the information started coming out about Russia's MK Ultra. They were running a twin sister project during that entire time. I mean, come on, they were running a twin sister space program and, you know, weapons program. Why wouldn't they also be running an MK Ultra program too? It only makes sense that they would be, but it's not something people widely know about. They think MK Ultra, they think America only. It was not America only. It was also Russia. The whole time. And so, and you know about that if you've watched The Minds of Men. But anyways, so we don't know about what China was doing, but you can just go ahead and assume. I mean, China's obviously, they're up on their technology. Look at the crazy social credit system that they're running on their people today. So all of these countries are doing all this technological research all during the Cold War. So it was either China or Russia, but Nixon went with his entourage, and all of a sudden, all of the people around him just started breaking down. They started weeping uncontrollably and having really bizarre, outlandish behavior, and it was done to everyone but Nixon. But so Nixon was there and had to witness everyone around him be psychologically targeted by something. Now, they don't actually say what that something was. If you read Gottlieb's testimony, Kennedy keeps trying to steer it to drugs and saying, was it drugs, you know? And Gottlieb is he's so sneaky with the semantics in his testimony. He does not actually say drugs, ever. He never actually says that's what it was. But he kind of drops it like so that people will assume based on what he said that it's drugs, even though if you read between the lines and you know they were working on other technologies at that time, there are a lot of things that could have been, including the EMF that they were definitely experimenting with in 1971. Again, 1971, MK Ultra was still going on. The revelations had not come out to the public yet about this. I just think it's really interesting that they were promoting and legitimizing the idea of using psychological disarmament against world leaders. I mean, you're talking about robotizing the robot. We're gonna puppet the puppet now. We got the strings and we can do it. And it's almost like they were sending a message at that time to all of society. This is something that can actually be done. We have the technology now to do this.
It does make an engaging picture. The leader of some aggressive country at his desk, laughing and smiling to himself, fat and happy like Gene Herschel, dandling his grandchildren on his knee, patting his dog, not a hostile thought in his head, totally incapable of picking up the phone to start a war.
Remember, in the 70s, you were on the tail of all of this crazy stuff that happened in the 60s with assassinations, with mass rioting. That's what the Violence Project, which was supposed to start in the early 70s, that's what they were talking about doing. Psychological disarmament, but of the whole population. So not just world leaders, right? But you have the counterculture that's going on. If you want to know more about how controlled the counterculture movement was and steered, just read Dave McGowan's book about Laurel Canyon. That'll tell you all you need to know about how real the counterculture movement was. You had Jose Delgado coming out talking about toward a psycho-civilized society, same premise that he's pushing in that book.
Physical control of the mind. And what I think the author has in mind here, based on what I've read so far, which is like half, is he wants to physically control the mind in order to have a more psycho-civilized society, which just sounds crazy.
Then you follow that up the year later with Violence in the Brain, with Mark and Irvin talking about how we have to turn off the violence switch in people. That's what we have to do. And that next year, you now have them coming out from the American Psychological Association. That's the president of the whole association, right? Coming out saying this is something that they're going to do to people. And not just anybody, but your president. So if you vote for the president, let's say you're somebody who still believes in the voting process, you vote for the president. Did you vote for the people who got together and psychologically disarmed the president? They don't say, you know. But if a group of people were talking about doing this, who are those people? Obviously, they'd be the people actually running anything. So this is the burgeoning scientific dictatorship 50 years ago, legitimizing the idea of interfering with people's minds, putting a switch on a person like we're straight up in a Looney Tunes cartoon or something, and controlling people. And so what do you really have? I mean, while they're promoting to the public this idea that these world leaders have too much power and at any moment they could push the red button and we're all gonna have to duck and cover like that's even gonna do anything, what they're really telling the public is we're not about to even live in a world where you have a world leader, because we can control anybody. We can control anybody. We can psychologically disarm people. And if you can psychologically disarm people, just by the way, then you can also psychologically arm people. Okay? Because these things always work both ways. If you want to start talking about when did the scientific dictatorship take over, I mean, there's a lot of, you could argue all day what actually constitutes a takeover. But as far as when did they have the technology to be able to do that in a widespread way, I mean, they were telling people they had it quite a long time ago.
His solution is to put the leaders of the world's great powers on a diet of drugs, tranquilizers or something. He said international agreements on this could be signed as we now sign disarmament agreements, and it could be called psychological disarmament.
What this story shows, though, is that as far back as 1971, they were telling everyone in a very open, blatant way, you don't really have world leaders anymore because we can psychologically disarm them. We can put controls in their mind. We can put psychological technology in people's minds, and we can control those people's feelings and their emotions and their drives. We can control this with technology. So as far back as 71, they were telling people that, I mean, that's just the bottom line. So by the time we get to a point where people are begging for AI to run things, I mean, you have to ask yourself, how long has that even been the case anyways? This is a scientific dictatorship, ultimately, regardless. It's a scientific dictatorship that nobody voted for, and we're talking 50 years ago almost. I don't think people realize that some of the level that this was taken to even at that time. And thus, where we are today is just a huge debate. It's up for debate. I mean, we live in a world of data now where they can make a candidate that is going to fit right into that niche of 50% of the population, right into that area of getting half of everyone to really love him and half of everyone else to really hate him. And it's all based on data. It's all based on using everyone's data and comments and everything that they've done online to feed back to the mass like a mirror of what half of people will love and half of people will hate, just enough to keep everyone divided and fighting amongst themselves. But the agenda itself doesn't change. It hasn't changed. It doesn't matter who's in there. It doesn't matter what side of the carpet we're talking about. None of that stuff is relevant anymore. People don't realize how far this technology's gone. That's not relevant anymore. Like, we're past that. We're so beyond that as a society now. This channel's not going to be reporting on any politics anytime soon, or the election cycle, whatever. Get all wrapped up in that if you want to, okay? But what's really going on in the background with the technology is so far beyond that. It's so far beyond it. People need to recognize the level things are.
Dr. Clark's idea may not be the solution to this problem, but it is a good description of it. John?
West German Chancellor Willy Brandt will be going to Moscow soon.
Where does that leave us today? I mean, we're entering a world now where I don't know how much of anything I've seen my entire life. I mean, I wasn't there for a lot of stuff. I know what I was told in the media about stuff. And I feel like that's a currency that's not worth the paper it's really printed on most of the time. And now we're about to enter into a deep fake land and a VR land, and I mean, it's just layers and layers and layers, right, of this stuff. But this is just to show you, I mean, this is the level it was at in 1971. So what level it's at today is anybody's guess.